Hello, and welcome to Know Before You Go. I'm Brother Joe Trout, coming to you for Sunday of the 30th week in Ordinary Time. And today's Gospel is where I'd like to start, because it's one that I'm sure you know very well. Right? Jesus is asked, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" And he answers, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest of the commandments. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now, one thing I'd like to note first here that we tend to pass on fairly quickly past is that Jesus does not say these are two equal commandments. Nor does he say that loving our neighbor is the whole of it, right? We live in a world where we tend to focus a lot on the love of neighbor, which is good. But second, that the highest commandment is to love God. Right? That has to be at the very heart of all that we do. God has to be first. Okay? Well, what does that mean? What does it really mean to say that God is the thing that is the highest of my loves? Well, one way to look at this, without going too far into the mountains and mountains and mountains written on what love is to just think of the Latin word caritas. Right, that we get charity from in English. But charity doesn't quite have the right connotation. Cherish might be a little bit better for us. That to love God is to cherish God. To cherish, to value highly, to prize it, to make it the highest of goods. That if you cherish something, it's not a Wall Street kind of value. It's, family heirlooms, mementos, things that there cannot be a price on, because they have a tremendous personal connection. That God is the thing that I treasure and would not give anything for, because I deeply, deeply long for and desire, and I see a good in it that maybe others don't see, but is a goodness that anchors my whole life. Right? So if God is the goodness that anchors my life, that then flows into loving my neighbor as myself. That I can see in another their value, their goodness, to see in others as beloved children of God the way I am a beloved child of God. Right? The difficulty with this, as I'm sure you've figured out in life, is that, great, okay, we should love God, we should love our neighbor, but what counts as love? Right? What counts? And this is highly controversial in our day and age. I am sure you have heard plenty of people say, well, the world would be better if we just loved one another more, or hate has no home here, this is a place of love, so on and so forth, right? Well, is it loving to support one another? Sure, but is it loving to challenge one another? Sure. When do I do which? Right? We could start to ask all kinds of questions about particular actions and if they count as love. But if we pull ourselves back, we think, well, one thing has to be true of any action for it to be loving, is that it has to be directed towards the value, the goodness of the other. Right? So if we think then of our first reading, we hear a couple of pretty important claims from Exodus. That we should care for the orphan and the widow, that we should not mistreat the alien, the immigrant amongst us, and that we should not exact, interest on loans. Well, what's this about? Well, the orphan and the widow. One way to think of this is, well, where do orphans and widows tend to come from? When do we tend to have lots of orphans and widows in a society? It's after war, right? Not the only time that we have them, but it's a primary time that there are lots of orphans and widows, because their husbands, their fathers have been killed off. And if we actually love those men, if we love soldiers, if we cherish goodness and peace in society, we can't just think of them as instruments to win a battle. We can't just think of them as resources to be sent to protect society. We have to think then of society, the people they've left behind. How do we care for them? How do we make sure that they aren't simply lost as more of the horrible consequences of war in this world? Because if they are, then what have we accomplished? Has good actually won? This is one of the great questions of Catholic social teaching on just war principles. That if you just harm society as a whole, well, you haven't really won in the end. because you haven't made a better world, right? If the innocent people are killed along with the soldiers, goodness didn't win, right? Now that's tricky, right? That gets very complicated because at the same time we recognize a lot of innocent people are going to be harmed in the process of making a better world. The world is full of a lot of evil. But we have to remain committed to that notion that the orphan and the widow, they are the things that we value. They are the people that we see tremendous, tremendous value in, and we want them to be well. The same can be said of the immigrant, right? When do we tend to have lots of immigrants? When things are going wrong. People don't leave their homes when everything is right and good there. They leave because of famine, oppression, war. They travel because they need to, right? If we think of the context of the book of Exodus, that adds a lot more to it. That in the historical context, well, there's a little debate on when this exactly was written. But if we take it at its face, right, that this is right after the people of Israel have fled from Egypt. This is a people who don't have a homeland, a people who were aliens in the land of Egypt. And when they arrived there, they were welcomed by Pharaoh. Pharaoh gave them a place to have their own tribe, to have their own land, to kind of care for themselves. But Pharaoh eventually, the later pharaohs, forgot Joseph, and they became an oppressed group that the Egyptians were frightened of, right? And so they fled. They are a people wandering in the desert, and they're told that they, when they have their own land, must not be the same. They must be a people who are committed to the good of all. In fact, that's a part of what this commandment about not exacting interest refers to. Because if someone gets a loan and you exact interest, you've just made the poor even poorer. The people who already did not have enough to provide for themselves, you have taken away even what they did have from them. And so to forbid the collecting of interest is to say when you get into the land, the promised land, you have to create a society where the poor are protected and they can't just be taken advantage of. Their money isn't what you value, their well-being is, right? And that doesn't mean that we're kind of putting each other at odds, that we still have to care for our own needs, our own necessities, but not at the expense of the other, okay? So we start to see something a little bit more practical about love here. We start to see some wisdom unfolding on how love has to take shape. It has to take shape in caring for people who are in need. That still doesn't give us the answers we would probably like to have in our world, right? You may have noticed that immigration is a controversial topic, to say the least, right? And I think it's safe to say this. No one has come up with a perfect answer on how to make it work, right? No one has found clear wisdom on how do we welcome people? How do we create a society that values one another, that provides for good in the world without just kind of destroying our own society in the process? No one has really figured this out, right? There is no simple, perfect political solution, and I'm not going to pretend to give you one right now. But I think it's something we do need to be thinking very seriously through. What would it look like in practice to value the people in need? And one way to maybe approach this, rather than from our modern political lens, is as St. Paul does. St. Paul reminds us to be imitators of him as he imitates Christ, to imitate the ones who are holy. How can we discover what it looks like to love the poor and the orphan and the widow, the alien, the stranger? How can we learn to love them? Look at the saints. Study the Mother Teresas, study the Dorothy Days, study St. Peter Claver. Look to the people who have truly cared for the needy and imitate them. Imitate the people who found ways to make the world better. Don't just get lost in the politics and the divides and all of the debates. Look to people who the church is saying to us, they found an answer. They found something that worked, that made the world more like the kingdom of God. What all of them hold in common, every single one, is that their lives were tremendously inconvenienced by their love, and none of them regretted it. None of them said, oh, this was a horrible burden. I hope it works out in the end because I lost everything trying to care for others. They died with Christ, knowing that they would rise with Christ. So the love that we are called to is always a sacrificial love. We are always called to carry the cross of Christ, to die with him, to love as he loved us. And when we see that in each and every one of the saints, we can start to discover ways to live that out in our own lives. But I invite you to consider, as you ponder through this next week, ponder through all of our readings, ponder through all of kind of the tragedies in our world, the world we live in that seems determined to not know peace. Where can we find the wisdom of bringing the holiness of God into this world? It's through the ones that we hold up as being children of God in eternity. It's through the saints that show us something. Imitate them, learn from them, learn from Christ, and that will guide us to bring about his reign on this earth. That will help open us up to the Spirit to transform the world, that even as horrors continue, we might find a place for the needy and the lost, that they might be cherished even in the darkness, that love can in the end prevail. This is always our hope, that even in the most horrific times in this world, that love can still be conquering in those tiny moments, that love can make the life of you, the life of me, the life of all those around us, a more splendid place, that we can share in the joy of God because he is our value. We are the things that are most valuable in this world. Each and every one of us human beings. Right? Have a wonderful day, and God bless.